All right, we're gonna start just a minute late. Sorry about that, folks. We had a little technical difficulty. No intro music, no nothing. We're gonna jumped straight in. Welcome to Argo Unpacked. I am your host today, Dan Garfield. Rubital may be joining us a little bit later. She had to flee her home as she was under attack. So hoping that everything will be fine there, and we'll come back to it when we get back to it. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about Argo CD and how we connect across multiple clusters and how we are redefining that story. Joining me today, I have Argo CD maintainer extraordinaire Jann, who has been with Red Hat and as a maintainer of Argo CD since 2019, really early days. Actually, was actually a maintainer before we brought it into the CNCF, it's kind of around the time we brought it into the CNCF and when we became an official, project of the CNCF. So, Jann, are you there? We looks like we just lost your camera feed.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Yeah.
I see myself in the camera, so.
Oh, yeah, it's showing up green for me for some reason.
Oh, let me.
Yeah, it's still showing up green.
Weird.
Yeah. Rubital confirms that you are indeed green.
That's weird. Well, anyway,
this is the cursed stream, dude. We started late. We had issues. We've got crazy stuff going on, and your camera drops out, but that's okay.
I can let me check.
So while Jann is doing that, let me pull him off the stage for a second, and we're going to talk about a couple of the things that have happened this week with Argo CD. Before we jump into the topic, we're going to be talking about how we are redefining the multi-cluster story with Argo CD. But going to start off by addressing some of the changes that have happened this last week in Argo CD. We actually had 2 releases with Argo CD. This is a bit unusual to have this many point releases right after a release. I think we've just been super proactive on dealing with bugs, and when I say we, I mean mostly Michael and some other folks. But we did have a few bug fixes that went out. One of them was an issue that was preventing auto heal from that back off was happening preemptively, which definitely we would consider like an important behavior to fix. The other one that happened this last week was we had a critical security update that went out. And for those of you who haven't seen this is actually a cross-site scripting vulnerability on the repositories page. And what this would basically allow is an attacker could give you essentially a malformed link, and they could then get access to the data on that repositories page. This has been fixed. That point release went out last week, and I believe the CodeFresh release has already gone out as well. So these are, these come up every once in a while. In this case, I think for CodeFresh users, it wasn't too big of a deal because this repositories page really isn't used by CodeFresh users in general. Because they use the control plane to do all this stuff, and so it wasn't really a security issue too much for that group. But if you are a CodeFresh user, or sorry, if you are an Argo user in general, definitely you do want to make sure you update and get this taken care of, because this kind of cross-site scripting vulnerability would allow people to potentially gain access to your repositories, and that would obviously be a big problem. It actually is cross-site scripting with permission to edit a repository. All right, Jann, let's bring you back. Oh, as soon as I add you to the stream, it cuts out. That's weird. Did you have any comment on this CVE, Jann, to add? Because I know you had worked on it as well.
No, I think you explained it pretty proper. So yeah, thanks to a couple of folks who worked on that and made sure that it'll hit the project, the public, so the fix hit it. So I think that's some great stuff.
Cool. All right. And then would you take a second, and I don't know what you did, if it was unplug and plug back in or whatever, but maybe do that one more time, and I'll leave you in the stream and see if it doesn't happen again. And then we had a comment. They said, "Hey Dan, good evening. Looking forward to this session. However, moving further, if you can also add Argo CD image updater, it would be really helpful." So does that mean that you'd like us to cover Argo CD image updater in a session maybe, or wondering if you might need some help with that project specifically? Feel free to ask that question, make that comment coming from YouTube, and we'll be happy to talk about it. Actually, I think Jann, you've helped with image updater, haven't you?
Yeah, I did. Actually, it's also one of my baby projects, I would say. So I was the person who gave birth to the Argo CD image updater back in,
Oh yeah.
I don't know, I think it was 2020 or 2021. So
oh yeah, you're the number one here. This is your project. I was trying to remember because we had I know that we helped out do a couple of the releases this last year. And
right, yeah,
on it, but
yeah, it was Pasha who jumped in and did a lot of great work because yeah, I didn't have any more time to maintain that, unfortunately. So you know, like filled up with so many other stuff, and yeah, I feel a little bit sorry for the community, to be honest, that you know that I had to redirect my attention to other things other than image updater. And you can see it's still not there is still no GA version, right? So but we are working toward that. Like a colleague of mine, he now took over the lead for the image updater, Chang. It's Chang
oh,
Fang.
Chang here, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, he's doing a really great job. And you know, he was like, after all these long-standing issues and the new issues, and you know, merging pull requests from the community here and fixing bugs there, and so I'm really happy and glad to see that that there is some new life in that. So
yeah, I think we've had really good we've had really good activity actually on this project this last year. I know Pasha jumped in and helped get some things merged and tested, and glad that
yeah.
Chang was taking the lead. And so I know that some of our users, our customers, use it as well. So I'm a big fan of Image Updater. I think it's a really great tool that you built, and thank you for making it. So
it's my pleasure. It was my COVID project, actually. Like
oh really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about the Argo CD agent. So another project of yours, and this is another one that's in Argo Labs. And so let me pull it up and put it on the screen for people that are watching. But of course, if you're just listening to the podcast, won't miss out on too much. But Argo CD agent, this is a tool that I've been watching carefully, and I've been really excited about the progress you've been making out on Jann with others. If I were to give it like the briefest overview, it's basically a tool that when you're using Argo CD, if you need to connect to a cluster that's behind the firewall, for example, you could go through a complex setup of setting up some kind of VPN tunnel on your Kubernetes cluster. And I find that those solutions are fairly delicate and difficult to use. Or you could use something like the Argo CD agent, which will deploy a component, that component on the cluster, and create a network tunnel back to Argo CD. Is that a decent summation, Jann? Or what did I miss?
It's part of that. So the story behind the Argo CD agent is a little bit bigger than that. So it doesn't only focus on
compute too.
Yeah, like it doesn't only focus on like, you know, who connects to whom in that scenario, but like if you go back a little bit in Argo CD's history, like how it all started, right? At Intuit they gave birth to Argo CD, and they had very specific requirements for that, right? I think they had a couple of really large Kubernetes clusters that they wanted to manage, and so the multi-cluster functionality that exists today in Argo CD is still a child of those requirements, right? So basically, you have that application controller that reaches out to all the clusters where you would like to reconcile to, um, and that works fine for, like, if you connect 5 clusters, 12 clusters, it still might be fine. And at some point in time, like, the compute requirements of that, they really get exorbitantly high, right? Compute network. If you take a look at how that works internally, like, the application controller reaches out to that remote cluster and lists all resources, caches all resources, watches all resources, right? And it does so for every single cluster that you connect to the application controller. Um, and it's very expensive to connect the cluster to Argo CD if it's a big cluster, right? So and people started struggling when their environments grew. Like, think about edge use cases, for example, right, where you have a lot of devices that you need to manage. Think about clusters as a cattle, where you never know, like, how many clusters you will have at any given moment, right? They can go away, they can come, and so the agent basically moves the compute from something that we call now the control plane, which hosts a central Argo CD API server, UI server, so that you keep your central observability, and moves out the compute that's required for the reconciliation out to those clusters, which we call managed clusters in this construct.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of a new terminology that the project introduces. And it helps with all kind of things, right? With the scaling, with the network, and then you have these two new components: the agent, which sits on the managed cluster or the workload cluster, and a principal that sits on the control plane, right? And I see you have shared that diagram from the README. It's a little bit out of date, I'm afraid. I've not updated the README for a long time. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. Well, if we were going to summarize, I guess we would say Argo CD agent is a way to distribute the compute overhead of running Argo CD onto all of the managed clusters, and also solve the networking challenges of connecting to disparate clusters, potentially behind firewalls or whatever. So it's really those two things, and it sounds like the scale has actually been more important to you and your users. And the way that it does this is it takes Argo CD and splits up the components, right? So Argo CD is this complex multi-service stack, right? We've got repo server, we've got application controller, and then you've got Argo CD server itself, which is what you're connecting to as an API. And you deploy onto those managed clusters the application controller, which is what's talking to the Kubernetes API, the repo server that's responsible for rendering manifests and talking to Git, and a Redis instance as well, along with the agent that allows the network connectivity. And then for Argo CD itself, it's not really aware that those components are even running on external clusters, right? They just happen. As far as it's concerned, they could all be happening on the same cluster, but it's just distributed that load out to those external clusters.
Yeah, that's true. And as you mentioned, like, so my most important goal in that is scalability and reliability, right? So because now you always have the application controller talking only to the local Kubernetes cluster, right? So it will always ever communicate with the API server on the cluster it's installed to, and the agent and the principal make sure it's basically a bidirectional watch and sync mechanism that they implement. A third point. So you mentioned scalability, and you also mentioned the network, right? And a third piece of the puzzle is actually credential management, right? So so in the normal Argo CD way, you would have to give the application controller a pretty highly privileged service account to reach out to that remote Kubernetes API. And the security departments usually, they, at that thought, they scream, like they say, hey, how can you, have all these highly privileged service account credentials bundled on your Argo CD, right, on that cluster? So what if someone compromises that? Like, how do you handle token rotation and all these kind of things? And I know, like, the big the hyperscalers, they have their own authentication mechanisms using, like AWS have their own authentication and authorization mechanism. Google has it, but in a lot of scenarios, if you have bare metal clusters or like whatever runs on your edge devices, right, you won't have those more sophisticated authentication mechanisms. So, and here you don't need to manage those credentials, right? So, because you don't need them at all. So,
yeah, because it's just using a local service account on the cluster.
Right. Yeah. So basically.
Jann, if you don't mind, I have a question. I want to take you guys one step backward, if I may.
Sure.
Because I'm really trying to understand what is the difference between the agent solution and installing Argo CD on each and every cluster. Because you do have a component of your agent in every cluster. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the main difference is that in the classical Argo CD setup, you configure the application controller with information on which clusters to connect to, right? It has to, if you have 10 clusters, you give it 10 API URLs to all these different clusters, and it reaches out to them, right? They need to be able to make a connection to this cluster. They need to authenticate to this cluster, and all this information is transmitted. Like what I said previously is that the way it reconciles the objects, the resources in the remote cluster, it first needs to list them. It needs to pull them all into a cache. It needs to establish watches. It's really very network and compute intensive operation. And that will put,
in terms of configuration, right? Configurations need to be spread all across the clusters.
Well, there is a beautiful thing that you don't need to do anything on the remote clusters, right? That is also like, I would say, one thing that people love about Argo CD, right? You give it a highly privileged credential, and you don't have to install anything on that remote cluster, right? It's sweet. It's the preposition of that is really nice, but it comes with all these problems, and the agent basically swaps those problems for a little bit more complexity on the remote cluster. So you have to install that agent, right? You have to point that agent to the control plane. So you basically revert that. Now the control plane doesn't need to know anything about the topology of the system. It doesn't need to know where your actual clusters are, right? It doesn't care if they are hosted on AKS or on GKE or wherever, like on your like, it doesn't need to know anything. It doesn't need to know any IP addresses, DNS names, nothing, right? The only thing that needs to be done is to install
those things.
Right, you don't have to expose them. Yeah.
So you basically have multiple agents and only one principal, if I remember the terms correctly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's the correct term, and okay. That's one of the terms that's not reflected in the diagram that's on the screen. So
true. I remember that from the talk on ArgoCon 2025. So you mentioned the agents; they do need to be aware of the principal, right? They need to know how to reach the principal, but the principal
Right.
does not, it's not the same like connection. It does not need to know how to reach them, but it
Right.
does
So
need to have a way to communicate with the agents.
yeah. So the direction of communication is basically unidirectional, right? So it's always the agent that connects to the principal, and the principal will never establish a connection to the agent. So internally, it's like a bidirectional gRPC screen for the technically inclined. But yeah, so the active component is the agent, and your control plane, like the addressing of that, hopefully rarely changes, right? And so to manage a new cluster, you would just install the agent, point it to the principal, and you should be ready to go. So
Yeah.
and obviously there's a couple of things that we need to work on. That is authentication. So there is, like, right now the authentication is based on MTLS that requires you to manage your own PKI, provide the agent with a client certificate. But there is some good things on the horizon to come, like with Spiffy and Spire and all that. Yeah.
So to contextualize it, for those that haven't read, and I'll throw it in the chat. But for those that haven't read, or actually, Revital, you have to throw it in the chat. But I put it in a link.
I will.
For you there. But we did a comprehensive overview of different Argo CD architectures, and there's hub and spoke, which most people are familiar with, which is the idea of you have a central Argo instance managing many clusters. And then there is the standalone, where you put an Argo instance on every cluster. So each one gets its own Argo CD instance. And then we have this idea of a split instance, which is where, and you can actually see we use the diagram on this article from Argo CD Agent, and we link to it, where you actually take Argo CD and take some of the components and put them on the remote clusters, while keeping the management centralized, located in that single place. And then the last one was a control plane, which is like CodeFresh is a control plane that allows you to manage and connect to multiple Argo instances. I actually don't think these are competitive in this case. I think that a control plane plus a split instance actually makes a lot of sense for scenarios where you want to keep resource usage low. And actually, let's get into even some of the limitations and advantages here. So like, if I'm using a split instance, so if I'm using the Argo CD agent, I've moved some of the components onto a remote cluster, and that remote cluster is now going to be using less resources than if I deployed an entire Argo CD instance. I don't have to set up networking to expose it to people. But on the flip side, I think the first question people are going to have when they look at that architecture is they're going to say, wait a second, what happens if I lose connection to my central Argo CD instance? Will it no longer function? Will my application set fail to generate applications and delete my applications or something like that? So what are the what happens, Jann, when the agent loses connection? Are there any downsides? I already know the answer, but you can.
No, that's a great question, and there is not a single answer to that, because so the agent and the principal, I always refer to them as like building blocks, right? There is no single true architecture in which you can use this, right? So you can basically move the repository server and the Redis server to the control plane, and have the application controller on the managed classes talk to those components on the control plane, right? So if you want to have a really lightweight managed cluster that only has the application controller to do the reconciliation, and don't want to waste any more of your precious compute on those devices, then obviously if the network connectivity between the managed cluster and the control plane, when that connection is lost, then the application control will have like a hard time doing anything, right? Like it doesn't have the Redis, it doesn't have the repository server anymore. In that case, basically your control plane becomes a single point of failure. But obviously, this is not acceptable to a lot of environments. So if you move, like if you go the full, I refer to that as autonomous setup, that you have all the required components on the managed server, like the repo server, the Redis, and the application controller, and maybe the application set controller, right? And the agent, for whatever reason, loses the connection to the control plane, or the agent, refuses to work for whatever reason, like, it doesn't find any node to be scheduled on the cluster or whatever, like it won't affect your Argo CD, right? It will still be able to reconcile the applications, and if you make a commit to Git, that application controller will be able to pick that up and reconcile it to the cluster. You lose observability, and you lose the possibility to make changes using the Argo CD UI or the Argo CD API. In that case, obviously, if they cannot communicate, then. But yeah, in general, it's designed in a way that you can really adapt it to your specific requirements, and you don't have to have a single point of failure if you don't want to. So
yeah. So if I've deployed, repo server and those other components, and is that actually just like, is that an installation option on like a Helm chart that says like what components you want?
To be honest, I haven't looked into the Helm chart, but I would be surprised if the Helm chart wouldn't allow you to do that. So that, and you mentioned, like, now that you mentioned it, like that's the current gap, right? There is a little or too little guidance for users to actually pick that up. And play around with it. We're working hard to to come up with all that documentation, and we provide a little bit of a CLI to just get people started, create a PKI that they can use to get started with that, and without having to go through all the hoops that's usually needed for setting up and maintaining a PKI, like for issuing and maintaining those client certificates that are required.
Yeah. But if you're running in that autonomous mode, you've got repo server, you got app controller. Really, if you update something in Git, even if it can't reach the Argo CD server, it's going to be able to go and render those manifests and deploy it. The exceptions would be like if you're using an application set controller, maybe that gets a little bit funky, because if you have it, if you don't have it deployed, then it can generate applications, but I don't think it can generate it on the managed cluster directly, can it?
Yeah, it depends on like where the application set controller is installed and which generators you use, right? So, for example, if you use like the cluster generators, it doesn't make sense to have the application set controller on the managed cluster, right? Because that cluster only knows itself. And that means like if you want to use something like the cluster generator, you'd want to have it on the control plane. And the way it works is that in the agent model, every managed agent that connects to the principal will have a cluster secret on the control plane created. So from the UI's perspective and from an application set controller perspective, all these clusters are available, and they look to the UI, to the CLI, to the application set controller as if it would be just your normal Argo CD setup, right? And it can generate applications targeting those clusters. And the way it works, or I should say supposed to work, but because I don't think it works right now, is that the application set generator will generate those applications on the control plane, and the principal and the agent will figure out like which application has to be created on which managed cluster, right? So
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
So there's this thing, there are some things that people just be aware of and paying attention to with their setup to make sure that they're going to get what they want out of it. And I think another one of those that I think was being important for people to know is that they're going to want to have, well, okay, let me put it differently. There's a limitation on how much safety there is in this setup when it comes to blast radius. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. And if I update my configuration of Argo CD and it causes a problem, maybe I upgraded my version and it's creating there's a regression that I just shipped or whatever, that will be pretty much immediately impact across this whole setup. And so if you're trying to limit blast radius, like I usually recommend to people not to use the same Argo instance for production as what they use for staging, so that they can test the changes in staging before they add it into production. And in this case, I would still recommend that if you were using a split instance approach here, because you're not really running different versions of Argo CD. You shouldn't in this setup. You should, when you update it, you should update all the components together, is my understanding. And then, if there's an issue, then you would downgrade all the components together at the same time on a split instance. So you still might want to have another Argo instance so you can test changes. Is there anything in that guidance I'm missing, or maybe I misunderstood with the agent?
I mean, like if you take a look at the vanilla Argo CD, like the common model of doing things, I mean that's perfectly good advice, right? Have different Argo CD instances, like a staging and a production, whatever. In the agent model, you can actually have a rolling upgrade, or you need to do a rolling upgrade, right? Because you will have, let's assume you have 100 clusters, you will need to update 100 clusters if you go and upgrade your Argo CD version, right? So you have to go through everything, and that's actually where you can test out these kind of things, right? So you go ahead and you upgrade your first cluster, and the blast radius of that change is limited to that cluster, right? Because you only touched that one.
Well, it's going to depend on the configuration change that you're making, right? So like if it's something that only impacts repo server and you have repo server in each location, then yeah, it would be, the blast radius would be limited to that managed cluster. But if it's something where like you've updated your Argo CD config map and it's going to have an impact, it would have an impact immediately across the board, right? And affect your Argo CD server, it would be all of them at once, right?
That's true. That's the downside if you have like a centralized system that every other cluster accesses, right?
And that's not a critique. It's just that's hey, split it. I think this is awesome. I think Argo CD Agent is really cool. I think it has tons of advantages. I think people should totally want to adopt this. But let's just make sure we understand like what it does and doesn't do. And I've seen this with people who are like, oh, I think canary releases are super cool. I'm going to replace my feature toggles now. And you're like, no, those are different things. You still need feature toggles in addition to your canary release, but they're just solving different problems. So it's just making sure we understand what it is and isn't solving, and what
totally
look out for.
Yeah. And I want to make sure that we're covering Carlos's two questions. A mirrored cluster secret from the management control plane.
So that goes back to the application sets. Can you use it? Because normally, you if you're using a cluster generator, you have to have the clusters be present. But on the managing cluster, it doesn't have those clusters present, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a topic that we really haven't thought about yet, because right now it is like that every managed cluster only knows itself, right? It wouldn't be able to make any use of these potentially mirrored cluster secrets to, to fan out to other clusters. That you have like a cascading way of doing things. It's definitely something to think about in the future. That maybe if your most concern is like network boundaries, right? So you have a control plane, and then you have different network zones, and in those network zones you have a whole bunch of clusters. And maybe for some people it would make sense to have like an agent as the entry point in that network zone, right? And that Argo CD and that agent will manage a couple of other clusters in that network zone in the normal push model, so to say, right? Like fan out. But yeah, that's really something we haven't really put any thought into yet. It's just
and maybe it's a good opportunity, Jann, to mention, maybe you already mentioned that, I was just not here, that the first version of this agent that was publicly available was 2 months back, I think.
Yeah, right. So there is a 0.1 version which which we put out to have people take a look at, try it out. And I totally understand that there is little guidance right now, so it's really hackish to get it up and running. We like I said, we're working on making that more accessible.
Right now, you'd kind of say it's like alpha level. Like, hey, if you want to take
it
this
is, yeah,
out, do it.
right.
Maybe don't deploy to production yet, because some of these
probably
guys
a good idea.
Figure out.
But we are very grateful for anybody who goes and goes the extra mile to try and get it up and running and come back with feedback, or what doesn't work, right? Like, what did they expect? Where was the expectation not met? Where is information missing? Where is functionality missing? And all these kind of things. We'll be really happy about those kind of feedback.
Okay. And another question from Carlos: are the agents update cycle managed from the central location?
That's another good question. And I think for the time being, we decided to not have any lifecycle management built into the project. We are partnering with another open source project, which is called Open Cluster Management. I don't know if people have heard about that, but Open Cluster Management is basically a tool that you can use to manage lifecycle of your fleet of clusters, and also do some kind of workload management. And they had a very rudimentary, they call it the pull model for Argo CD, that basically reverts. It is a little bit similar to how the agent works, in that there will be Argo CD instances that are running on the managed clusters, and have configuration distributed from the central location. And we are partnering up so that they integrate and embrace the Argo CD agent as the way of choice they integrate Argo CD. And from my point of view, this is basically a good place to lifecycle agent configuration and agent lifecycle, like upgrades and things like that.
So wait, is the OCM Argo CD add-on then, that is totally separate, but it does kind of cover some of the use case of just handling the networking, though it doesn't handle the workload distribution that you guys are doing?
Yeah, and they integrate it a little bit different. So one of the main propositions for the Argo CD agent is that you will keep all your beloved Argo CD user experience. You will be able to use the Argo CD UI. You don't have to think really differently than you have thought before, right? So for the user, from the user's perspective, it shouldn't matter if that Argo CD installation is using the Argo CD agent behind the scenes or not, right? So and the current way OCM integrates Argo CD as an add-on is that it works in a very narrow in a very narrow configuration. So I think it relies on application set, and you cannot use the Argo CD UI from a central console. They have their own UI to give you some status update. And yeah, so like I said, like we're trying to move OCM to be able to leverage the agent to give you that full Argo CD experience there too. Right?
So the plan is that OCM will actually leverage Argo CD agent as its way of handling the communication distribution of load. Because today they kind of it feels a little Frankenstein just looking at it, that like it's deploying these other components, but like they're not necessarily connected because there's this workload payload that's being pulled and passed on differently. So
it's modeled around their way of doing things, right? So so from that perspective, it makes total sense. But the agent tries to model around Argo CD, right, and not around OCM. So that's basically the differentiator.
So there is a plan actually to bring the Argo CD agent into this flow,
right?
So that you would get kind of the full featured Argo CD experience, even if you're using the OCM,
right,
to distribute stuff.
And from my point of view, it like obviously you can have other components that handle all the configuration lifecycle of the agent. I mean, you don't have to use OCM if you don't want to, right? So you can build your own if you want to. You can use other tools. I don't know what's out there for like all these things. I mean, you could integrate it probably into Terraform when you ramp up your clusters using Terraform or something like that. But it's like from the Argo CD agent's perspective, we don't think about lifecycle management within the project. It's a little bit out of scope for now, at least.
Yeah.
So
before we jump to this question, I want to come back to these questions. To kind of summarize some key takeaways from today's session, looking at the Argo CD agent that Jann, you have been leading, creating that, and I know that there's a number of contributors, but really cool project. This is a way that people can distribute their workload, distribute the performance of Argo CD onto the target clusters, the client clusters that are getting deployed to. It's a way to solve networking challenges as well. It's probably not ready for production, but it is ready for experimentation, and you're looking for feedback. You're looking for pull requests. You're looking just for issue creation. Hey, tell us what works, what doesn't work. I think even in this session where we've had people asking like, okay, how do I do the upgrades? How do I do that? How does it work with application sets? It's actually bringing up some of the things that are like, yeah, those are good questions that we need to figure out.
Yeah, definitely. And I encourage everyone, like if you have any detailed questions or ideas, just come to GitHub discussions, GitHub issue tracker. We have a Slack channel for the Argo CD agent on the CNCF Slack where you like can ask any question that you like. So
yeah, and I think like the model itself is very sound. I mean, we talked about like, okay, if we lose connection, that actually can still operate as long as I've deployed, the like repo server in addition to application controller and those other components. It can actually just continue to operate on its own. You just wouldn't have access through the UI, and for a lot of people, that's okay. So if I'm using edge clusters, like maybe I have semi trucks with Kubernetes or boats with Kubernetes clusters, and they're getting and losing connection. That's not necessarily a problem for this model because it can continue to deploy. And then I want to take a few questions that we're getting from the chat, and feel free, if you haven't added those questions to the chat yet, feel free to add them. Ashutosh asks, hello folks, how do we manage secrets from Argo UI? And I'm not sure exactly what Ashutosh is asking, because you can see secrets under your applications, and you can go and you can even edit them, and you can take off the base 64 decoding if you want to. So that is possible, but maybe they're asking about cluster secrets.
I think
they have to be done through the CLI.
Yeah, I think that question is targeted at cluster secrets, which we don't have a solution for in the UI yet, right? So
now there's a good reason for that, right? So the way that you connect to a cluster, when you add a cluster to Argo CD, you use the Argo CD CLI to do it, because it needs to use the local Kubernetes cluster credentials to connect to that cluster and create a service account, and then pass back the connection information that is then pushed into Argo CD. So the UI, the best case scenario for the UI supporting this would be that you get fields for like client. Oh yeah, he's asking about the cluster. Would be like you would have fields for the certificates, everything that you have in your local kube configuration. You would need to basically paste in to the UI or upload a kubeconfig file, which we would then have to go through a process of, because we actually don't use those credentials. We actually create new credentials, but when you're using the Argo CD CLI to create that. So yeah, that's the best case scenario is to use the CLI. You want to read this one, Revital?
Yes, and that was exactly one of the questions that I have had. How can one know from looking at an application manifest at principal whether the application is deployed using the Argo agent or directly by the principal?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but let me try to answer that. So if the question is, do you have access to the reconciliation status of the application on the principal, right? The answer is yes, because the status from the managed cluster, like where the application is actually reconciled to by the application controller that's installed on that particular cluster, that will be transmitted from the agent back to the principal, right? So it's basically if there is an update on the application on the agent side, it will be made available on the principal. If the question though is if you have any indication whether that application is residing on the principal cluster or on the agent cluster, the answer would be the target cluster is what you would be looking at, right? So just as you would do in Argo CD. I hope that answered the question. I don't know if I understood correctly. So
yeah,
sorry.
Like, I guess there's sort of the way I read it, sorry, Vital, is that they're wondering, like, if I'm just looking in the UI, is there a way to tell if it's being deployed on that client cluster or not? And really, it would just be to see what the destination cluster is.
Yeah.
But that destination cluster could say just in cluster, right?
But how do you distinguish between a cluster that has an agent versus a cluster with the principal? How do you distinguish between those two?
They have to have a name, right?
So like what you said, then you take a look at the destination cluster field in the application, right? So it will point, like, it will not say in cluster, it will say something different, right? Like when this application that's created on the principal is transferred to the managed cluster, there will obviously be changed to in cluster. But when, like, because on that particular system, on the real target system, it needs to be in cluster, but on the principle, it looks like it would go to a remote cluster. So
I think that's part of the setup process is you actually need to name each agent. You have to give it a cluster name, right?
yeah, right now that's the case. In the future, we plan to automate that a little, but right now you have to create basically a cluster with a name. Right.
Yeah, that was a topic that came up in our last episode where we were talking about like that Kubernetes doesn't have the concept of a name. Clusters don't have names. It's just that's like something that your kube config can have or Argo CD can have, but it is kind of funny that Kubernetes by itself doesn't have a name. It doesn't exist. Yeah, good question.
And we have Carl's comment. In the Argo CD UI, secrets data shown as
pluses.
Yes, on purpose.
Yeah, it's obfuscated on purpose, right? Because that's the whole purpose of Kubernetes secrets. I think you can decode it though. I think you can click on it to decode it. Am I wrong about that?
No, there is basically a promise that the Argo CD API makes that goes like, we will never give you the real data of secrets through the API, right? For
so you can't click to decode it. I thought for some reason you could click to decode it. Usually if I have to do this, I guess I'm pulling it from Kubernetes. I'm just doing kubectl to pull it and do a base 64 decode on it. So we don't ever expose it.
We shouldn't. Yeah. So
okay.
If we do, it's probably a bug and a security issue. So
okay. Well, if you have any security issues, go to the Argo CD project and be sure to give those responsible disclosure. And Jann is one of the folks on our security response SIG. So he'll be one of the folks that is taking a look at that and has been invaluable over the years in helping us assess security issues and address them. As we come to a close, I think, Jann, you're saying, hey, go install this thing, maybe not in production, but go try it out. Give us the feedback if you want to contribute. We're open to contributions. Yeah. Any other requests from the community?
Or maybe give us like, what are the next big things for the Argo CD agent so that maybe people would like to come and join and contribute. Give us like a teaser.
We really try hard to get production ready this year. And we are right now working on. So there is a couple of things that that are not yet really sorted out. I mean, if you imagine, like in Argo CD, you can basically run resource actions, right? You can make that diff, and that doesn't all work in all scenarios yet, but like that's something we are right now working on to make it happen, so that you can actually access the desired resources and the live resources, and run resource actions like, hey, restore that deployment and things like that. So that's the next big thing to come, hopefully within the next month. And yeah, we're trying to give the community something that can be used in production by the end of the year, maybe start of Q4, something like that. But yeah, like my call would be, try it out, contribute. We are grateful for every kind of contribution, right? Whether it be docs, whether it be code, whether it be great ideas to discuss, right? To drive something. Maybe we have a hole in the architecture that somebody finds and we can fix. So
yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Jann. And Rovital, what's next for Argo Unpacked?
Oh, wow. So first of all, feel free to subscribe here on argounpacked.com. Follow us on social. So we have LinkedIn, we have X, we have Blue Sky, and we also have our YouTube channel where we're basically having a lot of short videos that are being generated out of these shows. You can also see the full episodes. And we are supposed to be also live on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and those ones. But I will double check that, then pair our discussion before. So on our next episode, we have Mike Tugiron, I believe, from Adobe.
Yeah, Mike Tugeron coming on from
Tugeron.
Adobe. Mike is
Yes.
a great guy. He and I have given some KubeCon talks together. He's been a pretty good leader in the community, and they have a very large installation of Argo CD, actually many, many components to it. And so they've been doing a lot of work on kind of the frontier of Argo CD. And so we're going to have him come on, and we're going to talk all about those use cases and talk about what's interesting there. And please bring those questions again next time. We love having that discussion. And
I also recommend watching the video. He's watching Mike's talk on ArgoCon 2025. It's there. It's short. It's very impressive. So right before the show, I would think it's a great setting up some context before next episode.
Cool. Perfect. Let's see, Ravital, I'm going to hit the exo buttons to bring us off the stream. And with that, we're signing up from Argo Unpacked. Everybody stay synced, and we'll see you very, very soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.